to engage with Christians. First, it's important to not hate them. In paganism, it's easy to hold a grudge against those who took away our cultures, our ancestors' way of life, and replaced it with a religion much more accepting of the hierarchies that sought absolute rule. Most Christians today are unaware that their respective heritages were taken away from them. A more modern example of this is indigenous people and people of color adopting Christianity and even Islam. Indigenous descendants in Mexico being Catholic, or even Malcolm X, who believed Islam was the true religion for African-descended peoples. The indigenous people of Mexico and South America were tricked, attacked, and enslaved by the conquering, colonizing Catholics. And many African peoples forsook their indigenous beliefs for Islam because it's against Muslim beliefs to enslave other Muslims. Likewise, European-descended peoples had their cultures and religions taken away, often via the sword. The Northern Crusades and the crimes of Olaf Tryggvason are prime examples. So yes, it's easy to hate the Christian and be confused when they spout Western values, as though being Christian has anything to do with the West. Hell, if it wasn't for Arabic Muslims, we wouldn't have the philosophers of antiquity that many modern Christians point to when saying Western values. You can already start to see why Christians tend to be so wrong about history and their understanding of the world. And inherently, there's nothing wrong with the Abrahamic religions. Like any belief or ideology, it only becomes a problem when the believers exhibit toxic behavior, like inerrancy, as mentioned in my last video. It's good to wonder and speculate about existence, the meaning of life, and the metaphysical. The problem arises when we invalidate others. You may think your beliefs, way of life, and morals are correct, but ultimately, you don't know. Not with 100% certainty. We're all just guessing, and it would be ridiculous to hate someone just because their guess is wrong. Obviously, invalidating others shouldn't be accepted or tolerated, but hopefully we can bridge that gap through education and open discussion. As I mentioned in my Heathen Worldview video, there's a lot of major differences in perspectives. Black and white dichotomy. Firstly, we don't base our worldview on a cosmic battle of good versus evil. The world is a series of interconnected forces. Some crash, others flow. Not everything is conflict, and no god, deity, or force is an enemy by default. Some just don't get along so well. A frequent mistake Christians make is trying to find Satan in everything.
Could it be Satan?
Firstly, Satan would be a god in most religions, and second, Satan is a mistranslation of Jewish scripture. It means enemy, and he doesn't exist according to early Christian demonology. There are various rulers of hell, and many depictions of even Lucifer are modern. Most actually come from the story Paradise Lost. The Greek word daemon, from which we get demon, is also inaccurate. It simply refers to certain spirits, not necessarily malicious ones either. So any notions of Satan worship are inaccurate and likely propaganda and paranoia enacted by church leadership. In fact, many modern church notions of purity come specifically from Augustine, a Christian cleric whose sexual proclivities made him shun all deviant sexual behavior, something that affects us to this day. One God. Another gross assumption is that there is only one God. Why? What reason, other than old tomes, do we have to think this? There's no logical reason to believe there's one sole God. It's plausible there's a sole creator or even Godhead, but as the common meme says, no other God before me means other gods exist. And what about after? If Yahweh wants no gods before him, can we have gods after him? It's also a cyclical fallacy to say, this book proves God, and God proves this book. It goes around and around with no verifiable proof at the beginning. And the book has numerous translations. In fact, the King James Bible was created to appease the Puritans in England who believed the Protestant Church of England wasn't pure and literal enough. The King James Bible was translated from the Bishop's Bible, a copy most at the time disagreed with, and it was translated into English from English. Not a great historical resource in the slightest. The reality is that Yahweh Elohim Adonai was actually just the God of the Jewish people, and likely prior to Zoroastrian Persian influence, Judaism was henotheistic. They focused on one patron deity. They would worship one god from a pantheon of many, holding no other god before them. Often, the biblical conflicts with pagan cultures outside of the Jewish tribes seem more like conflicts between gods of separate pantheons, not one deity spreading his existence to the world.
Well, isn't that special?
Commandments. I was once asked by a Christian if we had anything like the 10 Commandments. I said no. Even the 9 noble virtues aren't commandments. They were just one interpretation of the virtues in the lore. She was flabbergasted by this. How do you know morality? Or something to that effect was said. Firstly, people naturally have empathy. I don't need divine intervention to know that causing harm is bad. If you need a special list to know that murder and theft are bad, there are much deeper problems to explore. And the adultery bit, which is male-centric, really would have stopped a lot of pain in this world if it had talked about consent. Thou shalt not touch or initiate sexual activity without consent would have covered more grounds. I don't need to be commanded by a higher power to understand right and wrong. And, to be honest, most of the commandments are about having one God, not morality. Heaven. Don't you want to go to heaven? No, not really. It sounds boring, and full of sandal-wearing hippies. Not to mention, there's no guarantee it exists, or that any specific version is the right one. Jewish scripture has people go to Sheol, a place not unlike hell, 1L, in Heathenry. And any one of the Christian, or Muslim for that matter, denominations could be correct. So by picking one denomination and running with it, you're gambling with your immortal soul. It's like playing all your chips on one roulette number square. I think, should an afterlife definitively exist, it doesn't make sense that it would require a special entrance membership card. Your 10th sacrament gets you a free holy smoothie. No, it makes much more sense to focus on this life, the life you know, and to do good deeds and leave epic stories for kith and kin to pass down.
With all of this in mind, I leave you with my revised list of the 2 commandments. Thou shalt always be honest and faithful to the provider of thy nookie, and thou shalt try real hard not to kill anyone, unless, of course, they pray to a different invisible man from the one you pray to. 2 is all you need. Moses could have carried him down the hill in his fucking pocket. And if they had a list like that, I wouldn't mind those folks in Alabama putting it up on the courthouse wall.
Summary. As you can see, there are many assumptions we all make about life and religion. We often believe the way things are now are how they've always been. It's hard to imagine a world before cars, television, even the internet for some. Once upon a time, people didn't have money or any currency, yet most people have difficulty imagining a world before capital existed. And that world invented great things far before money became society's resource. The majority of Christians were born into Christianity, and that's the world they know. Because of the Christian overculture, those seeking religion often seek the easiest one to find, Christianity. You're likely not far from a church right now. Paganism is difficult. It's gotten easier, but there's limited resources. Few pagan temples exist, and are usually small friend groups rather than actual places of worship. And research is also difficult. Many big names in the pagan communities didn't have the evidence or the internet to access it. So they turned to UPG and occultism to fill the gaps. And before that, we had systems based on notions of Christianity's pagan influences. We've had to evolve based on new evidence, and we still have trouble with a lot of different perspectives. But that's also something Christians have difficulty with. Where paganism and heathenry specifically have an accepted plurality, Christians are monotheistic, and with one God comes one imposed worldview. Paganism must think outside the box. But Christians are not only in the box is all they know. It's always confused me how they often boast about being raised in the church, yet have an "I found God" testimony. You didn't find Christianity. You've always been Christian. Your parents raised you without the choice. What you found was confirmation bias, confirmed even more by being surrounded by Christians. Hopefully this at least assists you in the future conversations with Christians. The only way to combat ignorance is knowledge. The only thing that will end hate is acceptance. Remember, if we try to control and manipulate the way oppressors have in the past, we just set a precedent for authoritarianism, replacing one totalitarian for another. Don't put yourself in harm's way, as obviously some demographics will not be safe around certain zealots. But if you can openly discuss things with a Christian, look at what's being said. Are they making an assumption from the schema they were raised to think is true? And think about your assumptions. Is everything you believe to be fact actually correct and accurate? Or simply an assumption verified by bias and anecdote? Be better tomorrow than you were yesterday. We are the sum of our actions. Skull!